السلام عليكم. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good day. I'm Zaina Samaiye from Hawkamah Institute of Corporate Governance, and I will be your host today for today's conference. On behalf of everyone at Hawkamah, let me start by welcoming you to our 15th annual conference, Building Investors' Confidence Through Governance. We are delighted you are here, both in person and virtually. And before I move on, I will take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, Dubai Chamber, Dubai Investments, Aramex, Daily Trust, Tonic, and last but not least, Dubai TV and Al Bayan Magazine, our media partners, for their support. Thank you. I will start with calling on His Excellency Dr. Ahmed bin Hassan Al Sheikh, Hawkamah's chairman, to join me on stage for the conference opening address. Your Excellency.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, good morning. Here we stand in front of you after a gap of 2 to 3 years, which has impacted our life very much. Some of that impact will last for years to come. We have seen businesses going bankrupt. We have seen countries going bankrupt in the last 2 to 3 years, and that made us, whether individual, families, or businesses, focus in many areas that we were neglecting it. Part of the areas that we were not focusing it much, sustainability, risk, and corporate governance. Sustainability, that we were taking it for granted. If we put a system, it will be sustained, and if we follow that system, it will show that the result will be there. However, we have seen a black swan, something that we haven't seen in our lifetime. That has affected the way that we look to think like sustainability. Risk, for example. No one of us has, put in his mind such a pandemic will affect us as much as it has affected us, whether it is financially, whether it's in even systems, even business model has changed during the last 2 to 3 years. Hawkamah comes with a corporate governance here, and a corporate governance that can help most of the ideas that you have in mind, and it can guide you into the sustainability and to risk orientation. Sustainability is something that we are looking at, not just as an individual here, but also as a government. UAE has focused much into the future of the growth of the systems and the country. The government itself, it is looking to advance itself as a sustainable procedures, as a sustainable issues that focusing. And we have seen that during the pandemic, that the government has done, it was one of the best to deal with such an issue. And all that came from focusing on many areas from the government side. And corporate governance is coming part of that focus. Today, in today's event, you will hear these 3 things: sustainability, risk, and corporate governance, as many other topics from this event. And I hope that you will enjoy each single words on that one. I know the topic is quite hard in many, but it's enjoyable if you will put it in your heart. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I would like now to call Professor Stephen Davis, Senior Fellow at Harvard Law School Program on Corporate Governance and co-chair of Hawkamah's Advisory Board, to deliver his keynote address on governance innovation to navigate crisis.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I want to thank also the chair, His Excellency Dr. Ahmed bin Hassan al-Sheikh, to the DIFC, Dr. Ashraf, and his crack team at Hawkamah, and our panelists from around the world, and to you, the participants here and online, who represent the vanguard of professional governance in the capital market. I also want to acknowledge my co-chair, Frank Dangard. Very delighted that, to be here together with him, and also to remember Peter Montagnon, our former chair, who died a couple of years ago, and we miss him greatly. Hawkamah, as you know, is the prime resource in the region for addressing cutting-edge governance challenges and solutions. So it's only fitting that we gather here today in something of a whirlwind of change to uncover underlying trends and share ways to handle them. There has, of course, been an onslaught of crises that have upended assumptions about business and investment in only the last few years. The pandemic, war in Ukraine, sharply elevated political risk in once stable jurisdictions, inflation, tensions over energy markets, climate shifts, supply chain disruption, growing nationalism amid a populist backlash against globalization. In my brief address, I plan to touch on how the big three estates of corporate governance, that is to say, regulators, investors, and corporate boards, are each innovating to navigate these crises, sometimes in ways largely hidden from view. So let me start with regulators, which will be the topic of the first panel today. Before the pandemic, the prevailing public policy model in North America, the EU, and Japan was that governments should largely stay clear of prescriptive regulation on environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, factors. Instead, governments sought to empower investors to police markets on corporate behavior. Now, however, grassroots public pressure has grown around the world for business to act responsibly on social interests, whether on drug prices in the pandemic or gas prices in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Exhibit A in just today's headlines: public fury over record oil company profits as energy prices rise and supplies constrict. Policymakers, not surprisingly, are quickly scrapping that old laissez-faire approach for intervention. In the case of oil companies, for instance, they may wind up adopting punitive windfall profits taxes. But rulemaking is moving well beyond that into the whole ESG space. The European Parliament just last week approved the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which will require EU companies to make detailed ESG disclosures, not just on financial materiality, but on how they impact society. The Biden administration in the United States has taken a U-turn from the Trump era, with forthcoming requirements on boards to disclose against fresh standards, such as on human capital management. Of course, the conviction is hardly new that companies have social obligations to fulfill. But now boards face a whole new set of reporting and behavior expectations to prove that they are earning that license to operate. The pendulum rocks the other way, too. We are now seeing in the United States a powerful backlash against ESG. For instance, in a May 10th speech, former Vice President Mike Pence called on states to rein in the rights of funds to engage in ESG investing, blasting the practice as elevating left-wing objectives. Other Republican lawmakers have since taken up the call, branding companies and investors who address ESG as showing wokeism. Texas has even passed legislation banning fund companies, such as BlackRock, from managing state money because they are said to be anti-fossil fuels. Now, with Republicans more powerful in Congress, the anti-ESG movement has a stronger platform from which to fight. Here's where innovation arises. A few years ago, ESMA, the European Securities Market Authority, introduced a new concept, which it called monitored self-regulation. The target was the proxy advisory industry, that is, firms that advise institutional investors on how to vote at shareholder meetings around the world. It is, as you likely know, a highly controversial industry. Companies react strongly when such advisors recommend votes against board members, or when CEOs accuse proxy advisors of getting their facts wrong about a company. So these CEOs and companies have clamored for regulation of the proxy voting industry. Now, ESMA heard that call, but it also understood that black letter regulation can be rigid and suppress innovation. So instead, it pressed the proxy advisory industry for principles of best practice, but it went further than that. ESMA insisted that stakeholders be empowered to scrutinize industry member compliance with those principles. I chair the independent oversight committee that monitors the proxy voting advisory and research industry, and we are delivering results without the need for harsh regulation. ESMA is now considering monitored self-regulation for other controversial areas in the capital market, opening the prospect of solutions in a middle ground between doing nothing and doing too much. Regulators elsewhere may well think about similar innovations, such as monitored self-regulation, as conflicting pressures arise for action. So let me shift next to investor stewardship, which we'll tackle in our second panel today. First, there is no doubt that investors are moving rapidly to active stewardship. Now, by definition, stewardship is the exercise of responsible care by an agent acting on behalf of an ultimate owner. Well, that's at least what the dictionary would say. But what does stewardship really mean? We know that the investor world has long been about buying and selling shares. But what's arisen parallel to the trading discipline is the discipline of stewardship. Stewardship is what you do with shares once you own them in order to optimize value over time. So that means not just voting shares as an investor, but also engaging with companies and other players as well. Big institutional investors have doubled or tripled the number of people who work on stewardship in just the last 5 years. Moreover, while these stewardship professionals used to be marginal players within funds, now they are very much at the heart of the investment process. And as they engage with portfolio companies, they are raising questions about ESG risk and opportunity in board composition, climate, employee health and safety, and a host of other issues. The question today is whether stewardship thrives or withers in a bear market. So far, there is no evidence that it is a fair market fad. Indeed, lawmakers and regulators continue to press for muscular stewardship by institutional investors. Moreover, if we think about innovation, one advance comes in the form of a fresh effort to build global infrastructure around the stewardship profession through an initiative called STEPS, short for Stewardship Professionals. Some of our participants today are involved in that project, as am I. But where innovation is really introduced may be understood in the context of that new anti-ESG movement I mentioned earlier. Critics of ESG assert that stewardship is grounded in left-wing political and social biases and should therefore be scrapped in favor of support for business executives and boards. But the truth is that stewardship is grounded more so each day on a vast new industry of analytics providers, where ESG might once have been general and aspirational. We investors want companies to tell us they acknowledge ESG issues. It is today all about stewardship professionals conducting detailed, granular testing of those commitments against both company information and externally sourced big data and AI. Investors are measuring factors such as water use, emissions, employee turnover, brand trust, you name it. Such data allow them either to express their confidence in boards or to challenge them to do better. So investor stewardship today is very much grounded now in evidence. Whether it is the right evidence, of course, is a debate for another day. Institutions are also drawing on innovation to demonstrate that their stewardship programs are aligned not with leftist ideology, but with the interests and preferences of their beneficiary clients. So BlackRock last year introduced a service whereby its larger investor clients can cast share votes themselves. Vanguard announced only this month that it expects to do something similar in 2023. And other big institutional investors, Schwab being the latest, are now incorporating new polling tools to anchor their stewardship priorities to those of clients. LGIM, Aviva, and Fidelity International in Britain are doing this using a startup fintech firm called Tumelo, while big EU asset managers, such as PGGM and APG, are long practiced in using classical opinion-gathering techniques. As these so-called expressions of wish services spread, it may be harder for critics to attack funds on ESG stewardship if their strategies are anchored both in hard data and in client opinion. Still, in my view, A further innovation could be to replace ESG as a term. I suggested this in a post on LinkedIn last June, and it drew a remarkable 39,000 views. There's clearly an appetite for discussing this idea. My proposal was to pivot to a phrase that returns us to the original concept of ensuring that both investors and companies take account of risks and opportunities that lie outside conventional accounting. So I suggested calling it ESG, or rather calling it 360-degree investing, or for companies, 360-degree management. That expression would signal that investors and directors are looking at the full range of insights, including ESG, of course, but also others that legitimately affect long-term value. So finally, let me turn to corporate boards. Crises have come like serial cyclones to companies, and we will doubtless hear guidance from our extraordinary panelists later today on how they can best navigate them. But one thing crises have done, as I've mentioned earlier, is to turbocharge investor stewardship. Are corporate boards ready for that? Innovation here would involve stress testing a board against the new challenges to make sure it has directors with skills in two-way communications and an ESG balance sheet that can pass muster against current investor opinion. Does the board have the information it needs? Is it well structured to act on that information? Crises have brought another consequence, a tide of pressure on companies to address political and social issues, whether it be on public health, the war in Ukraine, climate, political stability, or employee rights. Staying clear of such issues while suffering no effects is no longer a realistic option. For example, in the United States, a group of CEOs joined in a statement following the January 6, 2020 insurrection at the United States Capitol. They asserted support for democratic institutions, which made sense because U.S. political stability is an essential component of business growth. Many other companies, however, chose not to get involved. Either way, there were effects. Criticism from some that companies should be silent, and from others that more should speak out. Disney got entangled in such a case regarding gender issues in Florida. Adidas, only 3 weeks ago, had to disengage with Kanye West over racism and anti-Semitism charges. Coca-Cola and more than 1,000 other multinationals had to exit Russia under public pressure following Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So innovation here involves investment by big companies and their boards in better intelligence information on geopolitical risks facing their businesses, as well as risks arising from investor, NGO, and public pressure. It may also involve updating the job description for chairs and CEOs to include the kind of communication and public policy judgment skills we normally associate with politics more than business. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more innovation to discuss, so I'm delighted that following these remarks, we will have terrific panelists who will be able to lend insights far greater than mine. For now, thank you for listening, and again, thank you to Hawkamah and to all the distinguished participants joining us in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Let me take now very quickly everyone through what to expect from today's program. I believe you have a copy of the agenda in front of you. So we will be going through 3 panels. The first one will cover governance and ESG from the regulatory perspective. We'll move on then to cover the investor's perspective before we conclude with the boards and its oversight of the implementation of ESG practices. We have also scheduled a graduation ceremony for the Directors Development and Board Secretaries Certification programs, which will come next. I would like, just as a quick reminder, to let you know that a time has been allocated for Q&As at the end of each sessions. Now, for those attending virtually, you are welcome to post your questions in the chat box. So without any further delay, I will be calling on George Dallas, Policy Director at ICGN, who will be joining us from the UK to moderate the discussion between the regulators during our first panel discussion on the regulatory framework and the new ESG standards. A quick note that this panel is going to be moderated virtually. Thank you.
Great. I think that's my cue. And I'm also hearing an awful echo. So let me try one time. My technology is not working right now. Could everybody else turn off their microphones? That might help. Okay, and let me ask you, that's much better. Thank you very much. I think that solved the problem right there. So apologies for that unsmooth start, but let me, I think we're all okay now. Good. Well, good. Well, thank you again, and let me just start off by just expressing my thanks to Hawkamah for this invitation to take part in today's event. We're online, as you see. It would be great to see you all there, but I think that it's great that we can achieve this as having a global connection. And I'm particularly pleased to be asked to moderate this panel which will be focusing on regulation and the regulatory framework for addressing sustainability or ESG issues, both by companies and investors. As you will see, it's also a great honor, just given the impressive panel from the regulatory and standard setting communities that's been assembled for this today. And as you'll see, this is a knowledgeable and experienced group, and it represents a diverse and interesting range of jurisdictions and markets around the world. And this will help us to gain a regulatory perspective on the challenges that they face in their markets with regard to the regulation of sustainability or ESG factors. And this will also enable us to get a pretty interesting comparative perspective of the issues taken around the world in this regard. Just as background, I'm George Dallas. I'm Policy Director at ICGN. And I'll explain that in a moment, but I've also have prior experience working with a large asset management firm in the UK as Director of Corporate Governance there. For those of you who may not know ICGN, we're an investor-led network founded in 1995, and our investor members now manage about 70 trillion in assets under management, so a big piece of the capital market. I would say ICGN is fundamentally at its core an advocacy body, promoting on the one hand good corporate governance in companies that investors invest in, and then on the other hand responsible stewardship, in other words focusing on our own sector to ensure type of stewardship responsibilities that Stephen Davis just described, and try to set standards there. So we've been an active partner and participant in the debate that we'll be pursuing today relating to sustainability issues. And it's our job as ICGN to provide a platform and a policy foundation for investors to engage with companies and encourage them to address sustainability risks with the fundamental, again, link to their fiduciary duty to try to generate sustainable value creation for beneficiaries. ICGN is also a bit of a standard setter in its own right, and Stephen Davis referred to some of the European legislation, but earlier this month, the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, highlighted both ICGN and OECD's governance principles, two sets of standards as the two authoritative governance frameworks in the world. And it's going to be interesting to see how that may be affecting regulation that will be taking place in the European Union. And so it's really against this background that I think the Hawkamah organizers were possibly a bit provocative in the description of this program in the panel. And I think Stephen set it up beautifully a few moments ago. It's basically letting the market find its equilibrium on ESG is a thing of the pre-COVID past. And regulators seem to have lost faith, or do they have faith that investors can do what needs to be done? But then they are needing to developing their own ESG or sustainability expectations. And the issue is are we seeing, do we need more regulation in this space, or is a market-based approach appropriate, or is it some combination thereof? So I think the questions that we're going to be exploring today, is there some form of market failure, which is usually what invites regulation to happen, that calls for regulation of sustainability for both companies and investors? And linked to that are market forces, particularly the voice of investors, insufficient to encourage appropriate sustainability? And what is the role of regulation versus investor stewardship? How do you get the right balance? And can govern, a more philosophical issue is, can sustainability be something that really can be prescribed through legislation itself? And what should regulation focus on? Should it focus on disclosure items, which is the traditional approach? Or should it be getting a little bit more prescriptive, looking at things like processes, procedures, legal definitions of directors' duties, and that sort of thing, as we're seeing in the European Union? And then finally, how can investors and regulators work together in a complementary way? So I think these are some important issues that we're going to be exploring. And the panelists that we have, again, are going to be brilliant in putting all of these issues on the table. We have Dr. Mariam Al-Sawadi, CEO of the Securities and Commodities Authority in the UAE. We have Dr. Mohammed Farid, who's chairman of the Financial Regulatory Authority in Egypt and is also involved with IOSCO. We have Abigail Eng, who's the executive director of the Market Policy and Infrastructure Department at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Mark Babington, executive director of regulatory standards at the Financial Reporting Council in the UK. And then last and certainly not least, we have Louise Gardner from the Africa Working Group's coordinator, Sustainable Banking and Finance Network in South Africa, looking at not only after South Africa, but Africa and I think emerging markets in general to some extent. So as you see, we have a great diversity and expertise in this panel, and it's going to be interesting for me in particular to see how the ESG debate is taking place in the Middle East and in emerging markets, in part because the economy in the Middle East is very much dominated by fossil fuels, and how one reconciles sustainability in those dynamics, I think, is an important question. If there's one elephant in the room, or in terms of a jurisdiction that is not represented today, it would be the European Union, because they really have been setting the stage globally in terms of having a very proactive approach towards a sustainable finance agenda and various legislative initiatives to promote that, which represents the more prescriptive side and prescriptive approach to that. So in the context of what the European Union is doing, it's really going to be interesting to see what our panelists think about what's the right approach for their own markets. So what we're going to do is we're going to have some opening statements by each of the panelists. We're going to basically spell out what they're looking at in their regions, and then we're going to circle back have a bit of a conversation, saving some time at the end for Q&A. I hope that's all clear. And without further ado, I would like to ask Abigail to step up first. And you're at least you're speaking the furthest away from Dubai, so we're giving you the honor of kicking things off. So, Abigail, the floor is yours. And you're on mute. I still can't hear you, I'm afraid.
How about now? Did that work better? All right. Thanks, George. I was just saying, thanks, George, for the introduction, and I'm very privileged to be here today, virtually with the audience in Dubai. So thanks to the Hawkamah Institute, and I'm very privileged as well to be sharing the panel with so many of my regulatory colleagues across the globe. Some of us work more closely on IOSCO, so glad to see everyone here again. Just to kind of like maybe give a little bit of background of what we're looking at in this region, I think generally I like to start off by saying that climate change is actually the ultimate supply side shock. It has massive existential implications on health, both of our planet and for ourselves, actually. Our food supply, our energy supply, all that is clearly impacted. And while sometimes other issues, conflicts, regional conflicts can seem more pressing, but I think the longer we ignore the climate crisis and don't take decisive steps, the more intense and disruptive these forces are going to become. And I think the climate crisis demands really more than ever collective action. So nothing short of a whole of society or global effort across all our jurisdictions and beyond would suffice, I think. And I think that's the point a lot now of bringing global regulators together to have these conversations as well. So turning a little bit closer to home, Asia, I think it's no secret, and it's been said many times, Asia is seen to be key to the net zero transition for the world, right? It accounts for half of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and it's home to about 60% of the global population. So in this context, we find it's really important for the Southeast Asian or ASEAN voice to be heard in this conversation. So for MAS, back home, we lead the disclosure working group within the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, or ACMF, and we are working on promoting corporate sustainability reporting in the ASEAN region. So MAS has been leading ACMF efforts to communicate the ASEAN perspective, right, in international standard setting, being led by the ISSB, while at the same time setting the companies up for success by strengthening disclosure requirements in Singapore ourselves. MES also, we actively contribute in IOSCO in the Sustainable Finance Task Force, which is very closely involved in the development of the ISSB standards. There's a view that the IOSCO is taking, perhaps, if the standards are fit for purpose, IOSCO will potentially endorse the ISSB standards for adoption by IOSCO member jurisdictions. So this work has been ongoing. It's something that I think we plan to come up after the ISSB standards have been finalized sometime middle next year. So I think generally, while sustainability reporting will hear feedback, right, it presents a cost to companies. For ASEAN at least, we think the companies really need to have good disclosure at both regional and international levels because our investors are global, and investors, as we have heard, are increasingly demanding more robust disclosures. And ASEAN companies, as you know, have actually integral links to the supply chains of global companies. So as supply chain partners up and down the line, these companies will need to support sustainability linked data to these companies that they work with as part of responsible supply chain disclosures. So at the end of the day, what we've been kind of like communicating is that ASEAN companies, if they're not prepared well to provide decision useful sustainability related information, they're actually going to be risk being cut out from the global supply chain if they unduly hinder their upstream and downstream stakeholders' ability to meet their own sustainability disclosure requirements or their performance commitments that they've made. So I think the risk here is quite real. And ASEAN companies, therefore, in this way, are quite key to the transition to a low carbon economy. And even as we in the region and globally push for stricter disclosure standards, right, because there is the need to elevate the entire playing field, I think we must be careful not to leave anyone behind in this journey. Capacity building efforts, I think, is key and will be really important to equip companies with the know-how, right, to report against the upcoming disclosure standards. I think, again, in ASEAN, this is a particularly pertinent point. Our micro, small, and medium enterprises account for over 97% of our establishments in our ASEAN member states. So the clarion call, in a way, is that the low carbon transition must take place, we agree, but it must also be a just transition because a rising tide has to lift all boats. Thanks, George.
Thank you, Abigail. That was a great introduction in getting us off the ground. And I think you answered at least one of my questions that I put forward. You know, what is your regulatory focus? And I was hearing it's a lot of, I guess, disclosure in the first instance is and with the presumably with the presumption that disclosure ultimately promotes behaviors. Is that fair?
So you're spot on, George. I think disclosures is very much a focus that we have now and globally as well. I think the sustainability journey, it's going to be a multi-year one. And I think jurisdictions, as you mentioned, are really at different parts of the maturity curve. The EU, of course, has been doing this a long time, and they're very much at the mature part of the curve. But there are many other countries and regions, we're starting to get our feet wet. And even in regions, you may see different stages of preparedness or ability, and we must be able to help, right? People get onto the first step, right? Baby steps. And I think disclosure is very much a starter point for anyone who's going to want to start on the sustainability journey. I think knowing and making sure your investors know what you're doing. And in that process, right, you get a little bit more insight and self-awareness of where your company is going, the risk and opportunities that you face. We very much believe that it's actually a very appropriate place to start.
Thank you. Mark Babington, I would say that the UK is also in the mature end of the curve in many ways. And I know that, the UK punches above its weight. It's not only the substantial capital market unto itself, but I think its legacy of both governance and stewardship codes, mean that inevitably people will be interested in what the UK is looking at and thinking about in this context. And so your views in particular are welcome. And feel free also to comment on the relationship between the UK's approach and also the sort of, I don't know if you would call it a rival approach that's taking place in the European Union, but what is the equilibrium, or how is that working with regard to how you're coordinating with those authorities?
So thank you, George. I would say it's a really challenging time. You are right in terms of the UK has been a leader in terms of climate reporting and indeed wider ESG reporting. And we adopted TCFD mandatory reporting for companies, and we're actually seeing the benefits of high quality reporting coming through. I suppose the other thing I would say is that there's a strong UK tradition of stewardship underpinned by our stewardship code. And what we're seeing is significant pressure from the investor community to enhance and strengthen reporting on climate issues in particular. But I think, this brings me to the challenge, which is as a regulator, what we want is to see the provision of high quality, consistent and comparable information. And the challenge or the danger is that what we're seeing is the provision of ever more information, but is it decision useful? Is it actually meeting those investor needs? Is it actually giving an accurate picture of the state of affairs of that entity? And indeed, what we also need to recognise is that in order to support consistent high quality reporting, some of the information sources and information systems that underpin climate reporting need to be matured. They're comparatively immature compared to financial reporting, and therefore much remains to be done to bring them through a process where they can support high quality reporting and assurance. There's already been a reference to the ISSB and the work that it's doing. Of course, away from my day job, I sit as a member of the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, and we're working to put in place an ethical framework with our colleagues from the ISSB and an assurance framework to support the whole ecosystem of this type of reporting. And that remains a real challenge. But I think the other thing, and it sort of really comes back to your question, is we are best served by high quality global standards. Capital is global, and therefore you need to be able to make comparisons between all of the jurisdictions that are represented on this panel, and indeed in the audience at today's event. And in order to do that, it's really important that we lead the challenge and fight for high quality standards that exist at a global level. It's not really a time for rivalry and one sort of type of standard over the other. Business is best served and best supported, and investors are best served and supported where there is a global solution. We've seen that with IFRS, and we need to see that in ESG and sustainability. So thank you.
Let me just ask you this, Mark. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think the global solution is certainly what investors are looking for, and also not avoiding any sort of philosophical argument. But I mean, there does seem to be, at least in some circles, a tension between the Anglo-American approach, which is single materiality, and then the European approach, which is defining things on a double materiality basis. And could that become the foundation of a regulatory schism or a regulatory some form of fragmentation, do you think?
Well, I hope not, George. And I think an awful lot of my time and effort at the moment is really to try and avoid that situation happening. I think it's really important that where there are different regulatory approaches, we can demonstrate that there is an alignment between them. So therefore, behind all of these different things, there exists still a global baseline which allow companies that have obligations in multiple jurisdictions to meet those obligations through one set of filings or one set of reports. So there is a lot to fight for. And indeed, it's a busy time and will continue to do so.
Right. Thank you, Mark. Now I think it's time to go back to return to Dubai and talk about the local environment, and I think nobody's better placed really to do that than Dr. Mariam Al-Sawadi, CEO of the Securities and Commodities Authority. So really looking forward to what you have to say about what's going on in your market.
Well, thank you, George. First of all, to set the ball rolling, I would like to say that we are at a stage in time when adopting sustainable practices with full force in all areas is non-negotiable. It is, no more a matter of choice. Rather, the discussion is centered around the speed of adoption, so as to have, a maximum impact. We need to, save the planet for future generations. So it is really a generational responsibility, and all of us are stakeholders in this. As corporate sector, which devise and drives investment, our responsibility increases manifold. So as a regulator, my responsibility is to formulate and devise the policy and regulation so that it's to guide this, the investment towards sustainability. So most importantly, our regulatory aim and policies should be aimed at increasing awareness and also getting the required buy-in from, the authorities, from the public sector and the governments. So rest assured that, the capital markets in the UAE are not leaving any stones unearthed to achieve these aims. You're muted, George, sorry.
I am muted, sorry. Can I get back with you with, I sort of hinted at this in the introduction, and I'll also be asking Dr. Farid a similar question. sustainability, we've already heard that, of all of the various issues that are part of Stephen Davis's 360 degrees, climate is a big piece of that. And you all are representing markets of the world in which fossil fuels, which is a big problem, is the core of your economies. And how are you? And you said this is a generational responsibility. How are these issues being teed up in your markets? Because it seems to be a direct challenge to the foundation of your local, at least the regional economy.
Well, for sure, this is like the top of the agenda of the government. You know that the UAE is hosting COP28, so it's like it's in the agenda, as well as all the regulator here. They have created a task force from all the regulator in the UAE. So it's a really very important issue, and we are joining forces to have it, as I said, to become a priority and strategic priority for everyone. So, I don't know if you want me to speak about our initiatives, or maybe speak about that at a later stage, but just to share with you what is the UAE is doing, to make sustainability is a priority. You're muted again.
We may come back and visit that later, but let's now go to Dr. Farid. I think, again, you're bringing IOSCO perspective, I know, to this, but also your home market as well, and be interesting to see. Again, the floor is yours to take up these questions.
Thank you, George, for the introduction and trying to manage the panel and the speakers as well with the diverse views that we might be presenting at any point of time. I'll be speaking first and foremost on what we have been doing at the FRA at the local level as a starting point, and then linking what we have been doing with what is happening in international markets and on the front of IOSCO and the ISSB as well, and what is happening in COP27. For Egypt, we were early on the ESG disclosures, so we took it from a disclosure perspective, while trying to create several indices that is reflecting what are the best performing companies from an ESG perspective, and that was since 2010. Probably we were an early bird when it comes to the ESG. And then as we moved along, we kept adopting various forms of processes, various disclosures, incorporating bits here and there until 2021, whereby we explicitly announced a mandatory disclosure component for the TCFD and ESG reporting requirements. And probably it's not an easy aspect to make it mandatory for the entire spectrum of listed companies, and as well all companies operating under the FRA. For the audience, just to know what is the Financial Regulatory Authority of Egypt, we have a twin tower regulatory approach in Egypt, whereby the central bank is responsible for the conduct and prudential regulations of the banking sector and the financial stability, and all basically non-bank financial sector, from insurance, mortgage finance, capital markets, listing, derivatives, is from a conduct and prudential prudential and stability being regulated by the FRA. So basically, we implemented and issued the relevant decrees to make mandatory TCFD disclosures and other ESG disclosures for the entire spectrum of companies operating under the realm of the FRA. However, I'll tell you in the journey and why it is related to the ISSB, linking the dots together. We faced a bit of a challenge in 2020, 2021, while deciding on which framework to adopt, because what we found basically that we have several frameworks. Should we follow the GRI framework, or should it be the TCFD, or the SASB, or the UN Global Compact, or and so on and so forth. So basically, we had a very scattered reporting initiatives and reporting frameworks that each one is trying to tackle a separate matter in that regard. So basically, this is one of the challenges, and that's why having an international benchmark like to be issued by the ISSB and following some criteria by the IOSCO, which I could be representing as the vice chairman and the GEMC committee chair, a vetting process, adoption or monitoring the governance process of the ISSB foundation under the IFRS. Should the ISSB framework pass all of these vetting processes at the IOSCO, most probably we're going to adopt it once it's out. Why it is important? You need to have a benchmark that everyone can refer to. With a very important component that we're focusing on in the IOSCO is the interoperability of those standards. Otherwise, you will find yourself and reporting initiatives that are very scattered, and you don't have a unified place to revert to say, okay, I'm deviating from this standard by that much. You don't have it nowadays, and hence having this international, I would say, benchmark is quite important by the IOSCO and for other players. So despite that, we and in Egypt adopted a mandatory TCFD disclosure for companies with more than 500 million of sales. We're most probably as well, once it is out, we're going to think of having this adoption and interoperability, whereby and capacity building. So implementation, when we started to do it on the ground and see what's happening, we found that the biggest difficulty or the most difficult component would be the capacity building of the companies that are required to be doing the TCFD disclosures or the disclosures pertinent to the environment, ESG, and so on and so forth. But all of this, we need to put it into perspective. Ultimately, all disclosures that is being requested now is to increase the level of investments. There is quite a very important report that I would urge everyone actually to get to read it. It's from the independent high-level expert group on climate finance that was published in COP27 by the famous Nick Stearns from the LSE, whereby they reversed engineered the amount of funding and investments needed to just maintain the 1.5 degrees Celsius target alive for the globe. And the figures are very different than what we're seeing nowadays. We're seeing we're falling short of the $100 billion that has been announced. A few years ago, we're something like 87, and we realized, according to this report, that for the globe to keep the 1.5 Celsius alive, we need investments in the proximity of 1.3 trillion to 1.7 trillion annually by the year 2030, should we manage to keep this alive. So here we don't want to be, how can I say, disentangled from what is really needed. Disclosures and information is a component that should be helping in the investment mobilization in that area. And here I'll come and speak to one of your first alluded points. Did we lose faith? We cannot lose faith as regulators. It cannot happen. So regulators don't lose faith, given that they can enforce things as much as we can. But we definitely need to push more investments in the area of ESG and specifically, of course, environment. Environment is one component of the SDGs. We have women empowerment, we have poverty alleviation, we have education, we have better jobs, and so on and so forth, and all falls within ESG and SDG activities. So. And we need to as well grasp the opportunity as regulators that it is one of the very few moments that we're not acting because of a financial crisis. Usually you will find the regulators act very stringently because there is a financial crisis, that you're acting upon it, and so on and so forth. So here, any further regulations that we get to put, any improvements in the regulatory frameworks, any inducement of investments in the area of ESG is a demand-driven component. So this is an opportune chance where everyone is expecting regulators to be acting, and we should be acting, definitely. But this has to be coupled with the private sector believing and putting basically the money where the mouth is, as they say, in areas that is really environmentally important for the transition of what is happening in the globe in that area. So ISSB standards is very important because this would create the international guideline or benchmark for other players and as well other benchmarks. And the interoperability in the discussions with the ISSB, I've seen the documents themselves, they get to compare. Of course, single materiality and double materiality, we all agree that at a point of time, S3 or level 3 of emission calculations and so on is going to be adopted by the ISSB, but we need to overcome these minor differences so that we can see it a global baseline to ensure and facilitate for the process. But while doing so, we need to understand that it requires a lot of capacity building for specifically emerging market regulators, growing market regulators, and believe me, advanced market regulators. When you think about it, it is quite complex to make it embedded in the modus operandi, the normal modus operandi of companies is not the easiest. And hence, it's not only a matter of issuing the regulations. Issuing the regulations could be the easiest component and the easiest step. But however, to ensure that it is being implemented and implemented with the required quality and not to be having an overflow like Barrington mentioned of information and to have relevant information in that area, that is the challenge that we're seeing. And all of this, if it is not coupled with increased investments, then we have a problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Boy, there's a lot to think about in that. And I see, I think we will want to circle back, I think, to talk about what interoperability means. It's a word that people are talking about. I don't think I ever used it until it surfaced with regard to these discussions. And I think the other thing that I heard that sort of also came through in Singapore is the issue of capacity building, and particularly in emerging markets, and I think probably in the UAE as well. And I think that sets the stage actually rather nicely to turn to Louise, who focuses on these types of issues. I guess, well, she'll explain, but largely from an African or certainly an emerging markets perspective. And it'd be great to see how you would put these issues in the context of the markets that you're looking at.
Thanks, George. And thanks to Hawkamah for the invitation to speak today. And thank you to my fellow panelists who have done a really good job covering the intricacies of the issue. I'm optimistic that the current crisis, so to speak, in terms of ESG is actually a coming of age, and it's bringing to the surface how much work has been done in the last few decades to build up the voluntary and mandatory structures to make sustainable finance possible. And now it's about application and capacity building, as many of the panelists have said. So yes, my role is as working groups in Africa coordinator for a international learning platform called the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network. It's an initiative facilitated by the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank Group, and was established 10 years ago in collaboration with 10 emerging markets that were motivated to start building up national frameworks for sustainable finance. And when we talk about sustainable finance, we're talking about the full spectrum of doing finance in a sustainable way. So that is, it runs from the risk side, so the environmental, social, and governance risks that need to be managed, both at an institutional level, as well as at a market level, and has implications for how that's done at a project level. And then the opportunities, and we've seen significant opportunities arise in the last, I would say, 7 years. Green bonds really entered onto the global stage properly, I would say around 2015. We saw some early issuances before that, but by 2015, there was significant interest, and we've just seen the market grow, and we've seen sustainability-linked loans and instruments come to the fore, and that's now growing very, very rapidly. So this stretches from risk to opportunity, and much of it was driven by voluntary approaches prior to 2012. We saw, and I think we've heard initiatives mentioned like the Global Reporting Initiative, the UN Global Compact. Many of you will also be familiar with the IFC performance standards for managing sustainability in project finance and emerging markets. And so this is where the SBFN really originated to fill a need, which is that IFC, through its investments, requires financial institutions in emerging markets to adopt standards for environmental, social, and governance good practice. So managing environmental and social risks that do impact project viability, project success, and therefore impact investors and banks. So I think speaking to the materiality topic, it's been quite interesting for IFC to be involved in that discussion, and we're working quite closely with the ISSB and others on promoting disclosure in emerging markets. But from IFC's perspective as an investor, the materiality is really reflected in the IFC performance standards. And these were not invented as a nice to have. It was projects where things went wrong in the 1990s, lots of NGO pressure affecting the reputation of IFC and other investors alongside IFC, and there was a need to have some sort of set of standards. And so the IFC performance standards are now, through the Equator Principles, applied by 137 financial institutions globally. But what we started to see, I think towards 2012, in the run-up to SBFN being formed, is leading institutions, and that includes leading institutions in countries like Egypt, where the banks have been, some of the banks have really been at the forefront of this topic. Required a level playing field, required some sort of response from regulators, guidance, helping to eliminate the noise from different frameworks and different expectations, and actually helping to drill down into what are the material issues at a country level. So from 10 countries established, when we were established in 2012, we now represent 62 countries, 73 institutions, only in emerging markets. It's a mix of central banks, ministries of finance, and banking associations working together to define what constitutes sustainable finance, risk management, and opportunity at a country level. And that's really crucial from an emerging markets perspective, because I think, as Abigail pointed out, from the ASEAN perspective, things like the ASEAN Sustainable Finance Taxonomy is a response to initiatives like the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, because it is very important for emerging markets to have that voice and to be able to feed back to the global dialogue. What are the priorities? What are the realities in emerging markets? We see strong commitment from our members to work towards alignment. So there's absolutely an interest towards alignment and interoperability. 10 of our member countries have introduced sustainable finance taxonomies, and that doesn't include all the ASEAN countries that are now implementing the ASEAN taxonomy. There's a desire to work towards interoperability, but a really crucial stage that we're at in terms of implementation, where we're finding out what works in emerging markets, and we're also learning from lessons from the EU. So it would be premature to rush to one standard right now without a proper dialogue and finding out how emerging markets might be different. Examples are things like in emerging markets, social priorities are still very, very strong alongside environmental priorities, and climate change actually only heightens the importance of social priorities. And things like inclusivity and making sure SMEs come along in the transition to low carbon and green economies. So I'll kind of wrap up there. I think the really important message is we're seeing that over the last 10 years, our members, and we did a global study in 2021, showed that most countries have introduced very, very strong standards to support the financial sector to move in this direction. And there is a shift to capacity building. We recently worked with the World Bank to deliver capacity building for Central Bank of Egypt and FRA. And it's really great to see Dr. Farid on the panel, because Egypt has moved very quickly and is very committed to building these frameworks. In the network, we have Jordan, Iraq, Tunisia, Egypt, and Morocco. We have the central banks from each of those countries. In Egypt, we have the Federation of Egyptian Banks, and in Morocco, we have the Capital Markets Authority. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think the discussion today really highlights that maturity and how important it is to start embedding this in corporate governance.
Great. Thank you. Again, it's a consistent theme. Standards are being put in place, right? There's regulatory seriousness about addressing the issues. the key focus seems to be on disclosures. And there's some encouragement towards the trend towards consolidation of standards in the global baseline. But Louis, I mean, I don't know if there's been a lot of good stuff happening out in the sustainability reporting arena. We've been talking about this already with the formation of the ISSB and the various bodies that are coming under its umbrella. But it's a lot of stuff. I mean, and again, I'm thinking of capacity, but I think, by the way, I think Western markets also have a lot of capacity building to do in these issues as well. But do you think that your members are sometimes are they overwhelmed by this type of information? Do they want sort of a set of standards that may be more proportional for emerging markets, or how is this the global standards debate affecting the emerging markets that you're focusing on?
I think that's a very good question. The number of frameworks does get mentioned, but the need to discern between the frameworks, select and start to provide a kind of a clearer signal for emerging markets at a country level. I think we've maybe seen, rather than an overwhelm, we've seen a really rapid movement by the emerging markets and sophistication in dealing with these topics. One of the things that has been really effective is the public-private dialogue, the engagement between regulators and the financial sector. And we've heard reports that it's unprecedented in terms of collaboration and everyone being on the same page, which is really great. Our members are watching initiatives like ISSB, but even ISSB, when it comes at the moment in its current form, still leaves it to markets to decide on materiality to a great extent. And I think regulators play a big role in helping local financial institutions understand materiality at a local level, because I think that's the nice thing about materiality. It's very context specific. So understanding what local stakeholders, local regulators will need to be part of the materiality discussion for boards and for those preparing reports. There's also, I think one of the other challenges that we need to watch is making sure we achieve what it is we're trying to achieve. Dr. Farid and others talked about, we need to be creating the investments. How do we create the markets for sustainable finance products and, match supply and demand? And that's where the regulators have their most important role, is checking to see what is actually enabling innovation versus stifling it. And this is a very, very big discussion within the taxonomy space. Great having a taxonomy, wanting to align on taxonomies, but ultimately, how do you make sure that the investments are happening and that you're enabling rather than restricting?
Great, thank you. Seems like we've lost Dr. Farid, but the term interoperability has cropped up several times now, and I think that I think it's potentially an aspirational term. I'd love to hear somebody volunteer to explain what their view is. And Abigail, you're smiling. Tell us what interoperability means, and can this be the alchemy that can sort of reconcile single and double materiality?
I think in our work we always say it's a vexed question of materiality, but just to hark back to what you said earlier, I mean, the word interoperability, it's this 8-syllable word that has never been in anybody's daily vocabulary until the past 18 months or so. So it's something that many of us here eat, breathe, sleep, right? Most recently, I think that's the big thing that we're all going to have to kind of sort out in the next 6 to 12 months, actually. This is going to be key to achieve the goal of consistent and comparable disclosures, right? Like what Mark mentioned and what Dr. Farid mentioned as well. Because at the end of the day, we started with this alphabet soup of standards, right? We had GRI, IRC, SASB, and all. And we always said, okay, the key is to get the alphabet soup kind of like boiled down and let's have a global baseline. And then today we are facing a different kind of alphabet soup. It's kind of like moving it from the private sector to the public sector kind of alphabet soup. And we really, really don't want to go back there. So I think the wonderful thing, which I think Louise mentioned, is there's so much engagement amongst regulators, so much engagement between public and private sectors, because we all don't want to end up at that state. We don't exactly know how, but at least, everybody's kind of like pulling the same direction. And that I always feel very grateful for in all my conversations. So I think corporates are going to find it complicated, right? If you're saying that please comply with one set of standards, but if you're going to have to say do this and that, it's just not going to help the sustainability journey. But I tend to be an optimist, so I'm seeing some signs of convergence, right, in terms of interoperability being more achievable. It's not easy, but it's achievable. For example, ESRS's presentation architecture, right? Quite recently, they've come up to say that, look, taking a step towards interoperability and making sure this is going to work better for companies, we're going to align it with the TCFD's 4 pillars, right? And the ISSB architecture is based on the TCFD's 4 pillars. So I think a little move like that, is actually needle moving, right? For companies that are going to have to report. This is going to be able to maintain better comparability between the ESRS and ISSB standards. Obviously makes it easier for preparers to comply. And I think it keeps compliance costs down. And for the investor looking at the report, it's going to look a little bit more familiar and similar than before. So I think that's one heartening step. The other one is, I think, the question of materiality. Actually, I mean, 2 things perhaps to share. One is, in thinking about materiality, it's actually a spectrum, right? When you think about single or double materiality, there isn't a bright line where it kind of like falls. I think it's all a question of timeline, right? Something that you say isn't material in the next financial year, but actually because maybe you're impacting the water basin, right, that you are actually drawing your water supply for your factory on. In 5 years, it's going to hit your bottom line because you ain't got no clean water, to do your operations. So I think it's just a mindset shift, right? Because at the end of the day, it's going to come, and with the world it is, things are going to come in shorter and shorter cycles. So I think when we think about materiality, is basically what, like for the ISSB standards, is what would your investor be interested in? Very much the IFRS roots, Mark would be glad to know, right? What would your investors need to know, for them to understand your company, to make good investing decisions? So at the end of the day, is what investors want. And that is actually what's material. And what investors want to know is that in 10 years, because you didn't take care of the forest next to your factory, it's going to impact your bottom line? Yes, they would, right? So actually, I think the twain aren't that far apart when you look at it from that lens. And I think more practically, maybe more technical point about interoperability, it's a question of terminology that we've seen in our work. It's like even a simple thing like a word carbon credit or carbon offset. What does it mean in ESRS? What does it mean in ISSB? I think this is a difficult, painstaking work that we'll do together to make sure that at the end of the day, when the standards come out, as a preparer, you know what to do. And then as an investor, when you read it, you know exactly what it means. So that's kind of like my little take, short little whirlwind tour about what interoperability means to me today.
Okay, that was great. Thank you very much. And we have I want to get into opening the floor to questions in a few minutes, but I'd like to ask a few more questions to people, to some of the other panelists. And Dr. Farid, quickly, I just to maybe continue on what Abigail was talking about, you made an intriguing remark in your opening comments saying, I think you called these differences, philosophical differences, minor differences. And I know in other parts of the world that people don't see it as so minor. They almost see it as representing different philosophical schools of thought that are difficult to reconcile. So, maybe I like your optimism. Do you explain why you think that these are minor challenges for both regulators, companies, and investors to work with?
I didn't say they're minor challenges. They are actually significant challenges, but we need to work on. I mean, ultimately, if we're talking about accounting standards, it is when the IFRS foundation was established and then the adoption 20 years ago of the IOSCO of those standards that you got to see the accounting or the financial reporting standards of widely used, widely adopted, and endorsed by local regulators on local jurisdictions. So basically the differences are there. You have problematic issues definitely whereby each entity, the FSB and the TCFD, will keep how can I say it, the TCFD alive and so on and so forth. And here the ultimate point that we're not, these are not competing standards. You just need a benchmark whereby everyone can be saying, I am different than this benchmark and so and so, and that's why I believe it is better. You see my point? So these are not minor differences, they are significant differences, but the process through which the ISSB worked to come up with the standards, it took into account the GRI, the TCFD, and most probably all other reporting standards, whereby you can compare the different wordings, because some differences are in wordings and some other differences are philosophical, as you mentioned. So they get to explain the philosophy behind the differences. And this is a core, I would say, requirement from the ISSB and their capacity, the vice chair for their capacity building. During COP27, we explained explicitly that without sufficient capacity building, it will continue to be some regulations on the shelf rather than a global baseline whereby everyone can refer to. Just one point that I would like to add, to make investments in the sphere of environment more return, I would say, or providing lucratives and sweeteners, the importance that regulators need to move forward to would be regulating carbon markets, tradable carbon markets, and here from the voluntary perspective and the compulsory one as well in that area, because without having proper regulations as well, still you have scattered regulatory, you don't have regulatory environments, you have scattered reporting, calculating methodologies. And for example, in one of the, I would say, components that is quite confusing to me, you have the Gabon has been doing tremendous job in maintaining their forests, and they are not accounted as proper carbon credits because there was no deforestation in the first place. So basically, you would be benefiting anyone who's cutting the trees and doing the deforestation or the forest component, and because they're preserving the forests, because they're doing the act of cutting the trees, but while you're maintaining it right from the beginning, you're not getting any rewards from it. So these components need to be discussed on a higher level, definitely from regulators, from the UNFCCC and so on and so forth. But regulating carbon markets or putting a dent in the regulatory frameworks of carbon markets to add sweetness for investments. This is another component. Let's again agree on one item. I believe you want to open the floor, but let's agree on one item. Regulations, disclosures, whatever we are doing is a mean to an end and not an end in itself. So the mean of what we're doing is to increase the investments or to witness increased investments in the spheres or the areas that we need investments, more investments in. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. And I'm going to, in a moment, I'm going to put a question to Mark about the assurance of this information and the regulatory view on that. But before, I'd really like to bring Miriam into the conversation, inviting you to comment on any of the dialogue that you've heard thus far. One issue that we haven't really explored is what regulatory expectations of investors are. And also potential concerns about greenwashing, which is something that is the flip side of disclosures. And I don't know if how you're thinking about those issues.
Well, let me just say at the beginning that we consider that, changes create opportunities. You see, COVID era proved to us how critical sustainability was. So, and sustainability not only from climate change perspective, but from the perspective of logistic, supply chain, food security, as well as healthcare. So having all that in mind, I think regulators need to step in and also take this role, and of course work with the private sector hand in hand. So that's what is the intention. I mean, it was left for some time for the private sector to be dealing with this issue, but it did not have the impact or the desired effect. So just to give you an example, when the climate activists wanted to put a target for the world to contain emissions. Hence, the limit to contain global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is by the end of the century, and that was established in Paris conference on climate change since in 2015. See, now I think we are reaching that. I think maybe this needs to be revised by the government, whether in this COP in Egypt or in the UAE next year. So we need support from the government and regulator, I believe, in these issues. So speaking about also the carbon, UAE is working with the government and now to enable carbon emissions trading. In fact, just today I received an initiative from one of the financial markets about that. So it's really a very important issue that the UAE is looking at. And as Dr. Mohammed said, yes, we need to maybe choose some of these items and give it priority and then work jointly on.
Maybe we should use the same platform, Dr. Mari, to make it easy.
Pleasure, anytime. Yes, George.
And Mark, before we open it up, I did want to get. I know that you're very close to the auditing world as well, and I think with sustainability, I mean, I think an investor, again, the aspiration for investors would be to have sustainability reports with the same level of assurance, third-party assurance that one expects with financial reports. And what is that is that expectation realistic? And how does the idea of auditing sustainability reports from a double materiality perspective, how is that going to affect the strength of the opinion that auditors might offer, or what are the expectations there?
Look, I think it's really important that information is subject to independent assurance. And the reason for that is that increasingly sustainability information is being used by investors to make capital allocation decisions. And if that's the case, that information needs to be as reliable as financial information that traditionally has driven those allocation decisions. So in a sense, it's a critical matter of public trust. Can we provide high quality information that can be assured that people can rely on to take those decisions? Of course, in doing so, we recognize that, there is a process that takes a period of time to mature and develop some of that information, but it is really important. And I think, and I will borrow a line from Tom Seidenstein, the chair of the IAASB, where when he's spoken about this subject, he said, "Don't let perfect get in the way of good." And I think that's really important. This is a complex area. It's developing at pace, but we need to make sure that we're moving and creating better quality information to support effective decision making and to think about the financial consequences of the decisions that businesses take.
Beautifully summed up. I believe I know we got off to a bit late, but I don't know if the organizers want to cap this at the top of the hour, but I think we should have time for at least one or two questions from the audience. I'm not sure how that's going to happen because some of you are there physically, some of you are online virtually, but I'll just stop and see if there are any questions at this point. Is this because the room is not in a position? Is anybody in the audience there who would like to put a question, or is everybody set?
We have one question here. Can you hear me, George?
Please, yes.
Yes. So we got one question online, and we talked about the need for global standards, and we have a question about that how do you mitigate the risk that international coordination on the standard leads to the lowest common denominator instead of more aspirational goals?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Who wants to take that? Mark.
I think the key to this is effective engagement between the standard setting boards and the regulatory community, the investors, the wider users, to make sure that standards are being developed in a way that meets the needs of multiple jurisdictions and multiple markets. But standards also need to be scalable, so they can meet the needs of complex, sophisticated financial markets, but also developing markets. And so, you know, it is a particularly challenging exercise, but one that's really important that it's done right. And all I can say is that if you've seen, for instance, our comment letters to the ISSB from the FRC, we want to work with them to help make the standards as effective and as high quality as possible. We sent them over 70 pages of comments, so it's an extensive exercise. They received 1,300 letters from stakeholders. So, you know, we're going through an enormous exercise to try and mitigate that risk.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, Louise.
That's a great question. And at the risk of speaking on behalf of Abigail, but maybe she has something to add, I think we've been very inspired by the ASEAN approach, particularly around the taxonomy work, where we understand that this was one of the big priorities, is making sure that the taxonomy enables the countries that want to move quickly and far, that it enables them to do that, but then doesn't restrict the countries that might want to take a more cautious approach or start at a different starting point, that they are also enabled. And I think that philosophy is very important. We also saw it in South Africa with the Johannesburg Stock Exchange recently introduced very comprehensive guidance on ESG disclosure and climate disclosure, knowing that ISSB is coming. It was aligned with ISSB in kind of anticipation, but it includes core reporting requirements as well as leadership and aspirational reporting requirements. And I think we're seeing that more and more, and it's a very useful mechanism. Give a signal what great leadership looks like, but have a core fundamental that can bring everyone along.
Great, thank you. Are there any other at this stage?
We have one more question here.
Great, excellent.
Thank you very much. My name is Gustavo Montero. I am a crypto asset manager. You've all seen what's happening in the last few days in the digital markets. But before being a crypto asset manager, I was a CEO of Swiss Bank, and I was trained by one of the big four in Geneva. I was an auditor for 10 years. Given the situation in the digital markets, I'd like to know what your view is on how to regulate digital markets globally. Is it possible? Can we do it? Can we help with what's going on? Or else? What's your opinion on that?
Who would like to, any volunteers for that one? It's a hot issue. I think we're all thinking through what FTX is about and what that implies. Abigail, you have the bad habit of smiling. Oh, Mariam, okay.
Well, I believe it is possible because we are like member of the FATF, Financial Task Force. So I believe that FATF is really regulating this field, though it is like an initiative state, but it's still, it's still work in progress. And I believe this can be done once the market matures over the years.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, Abigail, please.
Thanks, George. I think it's a little bit not sustainability, absolutely sustainability related, but I think since we're here today and putting on an IOSCO hat as well, if anybody in the room is interested, what IOSCO has done is they set up a fintech task force, and actually the fintech task force has set up a program of work for 2023 precisely about global cooperation for the regulation of a digital asset space. So I think program work, if you can, it's all out there in the public already. There'll be 2 work streams that are ongoing. One is on digital assets, so things looking such as consumer access, custody, segregation, very pertinent questions in the last 72 hours. So a consultation paper from IOSCO is going to come out sometime first half of 2023. The other stream of work that global regulators are working together on is about DeFi. right? Because there's a whole other area of activity which takes in many different shapes and forms. So there's another stream of work on DeFi. So I mean, there is a lot of global cooperation in looking at these issues. So that's on the securities regulators side of the house. The FSB is also very actively looking at the digital asset markets. So just to kind of like point to those, so if anybody's interested, they can pick that up as well. Thanks, George.
Thank you. I think I probably better wrap things up, but I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm encouraged by the fact that I think that just looking at some very diverse markets, that there's a common commitment to trying to achieve the global baseline and a sense of urgency about making this happen. I think this is a journey. I think the issue of capacity building has to come, I think that's going to be one of the great challenges, both, again, not only in emerging markets, I think in developed markets as well, before this becomes a reality. But as Mark said, in a journey, you don't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. And it's encouraging to me to see this commitment amongst this group and others to achieving progress in this. So I would just like to say, on behalf of the panel, thank you very much for listening in, and thank you for the panelists for their excellent contributions. And I hand you back to Hawkamah.
Thank you, George. Just before we start with the graduation ceremony, I would like to invite His Excellency Dr. Ahmed bin Hassan al-Sheikh and Dr. Ashraf Jamaluddin for a word honoring Mr. Frank Dangard.
Frank has been on the Hawkamah International Advisory Board for 10 years, and he has been the chair and the co-chair. He has done massive contributions to Hawkamah over the years, and we would like just to thank him, a very simple token of thank you for his really wonderful contributions. Thank you, Frank, so much. Thank you for everything. Thank you.
Frank, it has really been a pleasure associating myself with you in the last few years. You've been 10, I've been 6, but it has been really a good journey that we have been riding it along with the rest of the advisory team. It's not much, but it's just saying thank you.
May I ask you to stay on stage, please? Yes. We'll now start with the graduation ceremony, calling on the participants from the Director Development Program on stage to collect their certification, starting with Mr. Mahdi Dalati. Mr. Mazen Filfil. Mr. العنود الهاشمي. Miss Jackie Ellenby. Ms. Jamie Simpson. We'll also mention Ms. Justin Jackson, who's not with us today to accept her certificate. Yeah, she's not here. She's not here? Yeah. Okay. From the Certified Board Secretaries Program, we start with Mr. Yasser Dabash. Ms. Manar Ibrahim. Ms. Rizwan Agazwan. Ms. Abir Helwanji. Ms. Amanda Dahdah. Ms. Basma Al-Hilawi. Ms. Sahar Shaib. Mr. Taloon Dalal. Ms. Pauline Emor. Ms. Sireen Makahle. Ms. Rula Al-Kurdi. Mr. Ala Hassan. Ms. Raneem Mahmoud. And finally, Denise Sham'oun, who's not with us today to accept her certificate. Congratulations to everyone. It is time now for the lunch break, which we will be hosting just outside. And it would be great if you would please return to this room by 2:15. Please enjoy your lunch.